Charles, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
The Bone Man of Kokoda. What a fantastic story that is.
It is. It's almost an epic story. I mean, if he was born in another time, he might have described his life as an epic. He's crammed about 3 lives into his 88 years on this earth, and he's still going pretty strong.
Now, how did you come across this story?
I walked Kokoda 2 years ago, almost to the week, with some friends from Melbourne. And about halfway along the track, we were walking through a village called Afogi, and your listeners who've walked Kokoda will know what I'm talking about. And one of the New Guinea porters in our group pointed out, or I happened to be walking alongside, he pointed out this stone cairn on the edge of the village, and he said, "Oh, the guy who built that is Japanese, and he's been living in New Guinea for 20 years trying to find the remains of his old friends who died in the war to take them back to Japan." And I thought, gee, that's a good story. And I'm a journalist by trade, so I just, the news antennae started twitching madly. And when I got back to Melbourne, I started researching this guy, and I eventually tracked him down to Tokyo. And really the stories I'd heard about him only sort of scratched the surface of his life. The more I researched his life and the more I spoke to him, I realised, in fact, the story was an awful lot better.
How difficult was it to research his story and to interview him? Because his English is not that good, if at all, is it?
No, I'd still say it was better than my Japanese, though. He's 88, as I said. He's doesn't have a computer, doesn't speak real. He had a bit of pidgin English that he learned in New Guinea when he was back there. But it was awfully difficult, and it was expensive too, because I had to have an interpreter every time with me when I spoke to him. So I went to Tokyo twice to interview him, and then the rest of the time I've done it really by fax. I've faxed him some questions I had, again, which had to be translated here in Melbourne and then sent to him, and then he'd go through his records and send the answers back in Japanese, and they'd have to be translated again. So it was quite a painstaking process, I have to say, and it took sort of 15 or 16 months in the end, and I think if I was doing a similar book with an Australian digger, it would have taken half that time.
And yet you were still, even with that process, you've still been able to capture the essence of this person.
Oh, well, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, look, as I say, the more I dug and the more I researched and the more I sat down with him and just sort of explored these various episodes in his life, the more I realised what a remarkable man he was and how unique he was. He had these deeply ingrained notions of duty and sacrifice and honour. And the reason he went back to... Sorry, just in Précis, the book, he, as you know, he fought against the Australians in the war at Kokoda, and his entire platoon was wiped out within 3 weeks of heading off from Kokoda towards Port Moresby, which was their goal. So 56 men in his platoon, all of them grew up in his hometown or the surrounds called Kokichi City, so a lot of them were friends and had been to school together. And as I say, within 3 weeks, 55 of them had been killed, and he himself had got 3 machine gun bullets in his right shoulder, one of which still sits under his right shoulder blade to this day. And then several months later, he was involved in the siege of the northern beaches in New Guinea, which was early 1943. And the Allies, the Australians and the Americans, were attacking the Japanese from the south, and the Japanese had the Solomon Sea at their backs. They had nowhere to go, so they were pinned down for a couple of months. Their rice ration ran out. Nishimura, however, despite the bullet wounds, was one of the fittest ones there and was able to be evacuated. He had to leave behind hundreds of his comrades and his friends on the northern beaches who were ordered to fight to the last man. And that is when he said to them, look, if I survive this war, I'll come back to pick up your remains and I'll take them back to Japan and give you a proper Buddhist funeral.
Did you realise what promise he was making at the time, do you think?
I think it's hard to know that. Look, I think he felt a sense of guilt at surviving the war when virtually every one of his friends didn't. And I also think he is a man of incredible determination, and a man of honour as well, where his word is his bond. He felt like these men who were left to fight over that stretch of beach while he was being evacuated really helped save his life. He gave them his promise that he'd return, so he felt like he had nothing else to do but to make good on his promise.
I found that he was a really good example of how we contradict ourselves, how our personalities contradict all the time. He didn't hesitate in his serving for Japan, and he went to war knowing he would have to kill, and he would do it. Simple as that.
Yeah, I think that is a common story among servicemen from any army, that they head off to war with an enthusiasm and a spring in their step, and the notion that they're fighting a just cause for defending their country. And yet the war did terrible things to him, and he was scarred by it horribly, physically and mentally. And I'm not sure he ever got over it, really.
And he went back to find the remains of his comrades and a lot of other soldiers that had lost their lives in the war. And he was committed to that, yet he left his wife and 2 sons behind.
Yeah, his sense of duty towards his friends and his fellow soldiers overrode his sense of duty to his family, which is a difficult thing to get your head around, probably for you and I. But for him, there was no contest. So in 1979, when he turned 60, he just retired from his job. He called his family around. He got married shortly after the war, and he had 4 children, one of whom died in a car accident. So he had his 3 children with him and his wife, and he said, look, I'm going to go and live in New Guinea. And it may take several years, this project I want to do. And his wife shouted at him and said, you're crazy, your life is here with us. And his 2 sons said, it'd be too expensive and too dangerous, Dad, we want you to stay. But he said, I'm sorry, you're not going to sway me. This is what I'm going to do. I've got my mind made up. And he said, if you don't like the decision, you can leave the house, which is in fact what they did. His wife and 2 sons left. And he said, I'll give you everything I own because I don't want to be accused of leaving you with nothing. And his daughter sided with him. So it was 1979, and he has not seen them for 29 years, much less spoken to them.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Well, the sacrifices he has made in his life, the family being the obvious one, but also selling up this very successful engineering firm that he'd built up in Tokyo, all his personal fortune. He was a fairly well-to-do man. The creature comforts that he had in Tokyo, all of that went so he could fulfil this promise he'd made 37 years earlier.
And yet when he went back to New Guinea, he lived very, very simply, didn't he?
It was a very Spartan life. He built himself I wouldn't even call it a hut, it was a grander structure than that. It was almost a house in Popondetta, which gave him easy access to both the northern beaches and to the Kokoda Track. It was sort of halfway between the two. And he lived on basically rice and tinned fish, and he grew some mangoes in his garden and spring onions, and he was never one for fine dining or living grandly. He was quite happy. In fact, he felt much more comfortable living this austere life, so it actually suited him quite nicely.
Well, he grew up with very little as a child too, didn't he?
He did, yeah. His father died when he was very young, when he was 8 or 9. So was forced to become the chief breadwinner from the time he was about 15. So he became the man of the house very quickly, had to grow up quickly. He was never allowed really to have a childhood in a way, and he never played games with his friends much. It was a pretty grim old time, and he was forced out of the workforce to look after his mother and his sisters.
It was interesting also how little support, if any, that he got from the Japanese government.
He got virtually none, and it's a hard thing to understand, really, when this man has spent a third of his life almost doing the Japanese government's work in digging up, trying to repatriate the bones of these soldiers who died serving their country. He got no recognition at all, really. The equivalent of the ABC in Japan, the Japan Broadcasting Corporation, did a 40-minute documentary on him in 1997. There's been a few newspaper reports of his work. By and large, though, he's anonymous and he has no profile and has had very little recognition. So that's what he feels very angry about that the government has done so little to find the 1.16 million Japanese that are still, the bodies of them, who are still lost around the Pacific Ocean, or sort of islands and countries within the Pacific. 1.16 million. Nishimura, I imagine, if he was an Australian or an American and had done this sort of work, had devoted a third of his life for a mission like this, he would have a massive profile, would have probably civilian gongs being bestowed upon him, maybe the odd statue erected in his honour, but Nishimura has just done this work alone, and he's not motivated by personal glory or recognition. He's happy to do it by himself, but he's just annoyed that the government has made such a lame attempt to recover Japanese soldiers, and he feels like the government has almost turned its back on the war. The shame of defeat meant that it is not a subject that is talked about or taught in schools. They've embarked on this massive construction boom and becoming a real economic powerhouse after the war, and Nishimura feels they've done it while shunning all those soldiers who've died defending the country. Sorry, not defending the country, that's wrong. Died while serving the Imperial Army, yeah.
Yeah. Yet, if the country doesn't recognise it, that's how these sorts of things can happen again.
That is true. I mean, that is true. I think the constitution in Japan says that they cannot remilitarise, they cannot rearm. So they are worried about the Chinese expansion over the sea nearby, but they have learnt their lessons to the extent from World War II that they never want to go to war again.
Yeah.
But I should say, Michelle, it's a difficult subject to write about, being an Australian. The Japanese in war, as we know, were not a good enemy. They were barbaric at times. They treated their prisoners appallingly, many of whom were Australian. And they had this sort of uncommon bloodlust. But there were a lot of 19 and 20-year-old soldiers who, in New Guinea, you couldn't understand why they were fighting over this godforsaken malarial swamp. They just wanted to go home, you know. So there was, within the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army, there was some humanity, and I think Nishimura's life story is probably testament to that.
There was comments, I think, in the opinion letters to the Age, possibly not long after one of the reviews was put in the Age, that, you know, why even promote a story like this? You know, we don't need to hear about it. But I mean, that's the exact attitude that keeps that bitterness and that anger there. If you can't see the other side, if you can't see the human side of other people, then there's always that little seed that keeps conflict at whatever level going.
That is true. I mean, history is written by the winners. We know that. We've heard about Kokoda from the Australian side through a lot of recent books, excellent books like the Paul Ham book on Kokoda and the Peter Fitzsimons book, and they're all Patrick Lindsay and Peter Brune. They're all wonderful and give us a picture of the battle from the southern side, if you like, from the Australian side. We don't really know much about the battle from the Japanese side. Yes, they were the aggressors for sure, and came up against some extraordinarily courageous Australian soldiers and fighting. But it was interesting. In the course of researching the book, I spoke to 4 soldiers from the 39th Battalion, the Australian militia, who were sent to meet the Japanese head-on along the Kokoda Track. And 3 of them, these are all men in their late 80s and early 90s, 3 of them had got on with their life and bore the Japanese no real malice. They acknowledged they were not a good enemy, but they said that you can't let your life become sort of bogged down in bitterness. You've just got to get on with it. However, the 4th man said one of his friends had been beheaded by the Japanese and he could never forgive them for that, and he really wanted nothing to do with the Japanese race. He didn't like them at all.
Yeah, yeah. And of course you can understand where that comes from.
You can,
too, of
yeah,
course.
look,
Yeah.
who are we to judge him for that?
Yeah, that's right. What was the most memorable experience for you writing this book?
Well, I suppose it taught me a lot about the New Guinea campaign, which I didn't really know an awful lot about before. The Kokoda campaign. It taught me a lot about determination and single-mindedness, and how, if I get wet running for the bus, or if I get a parking ticket, or get I don't know, the travails of modern life that we kind of get worked up about. You get hit in the shins with a supermarket trolley that doesn't work or something like that. I mean, really, in the grand scheme of things, we shouldn't get too worked up about those minor trifles. In the context of a life like Nishimura's, it really doesn't count for much.
Well, congratulations on the book.
Well, thank you, Michelle.
It's kind of refreshing to read about a Japanese soldier, and just that extraordinary story of just going back to New Guinea for all those years to recover those bones and return as many as you can to the families.
Yeah, look, he's had I'm not doing justice really in talking about his life for the 10 or 15 minutes we've got, but he had this mystical ability to survive the war in the first place. His troop ship, as well as being shot 3 times, his troop ship was torpedoed and sunk by an American submarine at one stage outside Taiwan. He was in the water for 15 hours before being rescued. He got malaria at least half a dozen times. His weight was down to 30 kilograms at one stage. After the rice ration ran out, 30 kilograms is sort of the weight of an average 9 or 10-year-old boy. In spite of all that, he survived, and he was able to make good on this promise. And so the nub of the book is really, I'd say, about really what he did after the war than what he did during the war.
And of course, the other unique aspect was he was an extremely intelligent person, wasn't he?
He was, and brilliant with his hands. And became one of the better-known engineers in Tokyo, and so much so that the founder of the Sony Corporation, Akio Morita, came to rely on Nishimura to be almost his personal troubleshooter. If anything really went wrong at the Sony headquarters, he'd jump on the phone to Nishimura. And together, these two men, one of the most modest upbringing, who left school at 11, talking with probably Japan's greatest industrialist and the highest profile Japanese of his generation. They used to have a chinwag about their mutual love of electronics and engineering and things. It's one of the many fascinating parts of his life.
It's definitely a great read. Charles Happell, thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you, Michelle.